The community center in Cedar Falls, Iowa, was packed tight on a chilly November evening. The faint smell of burnt coffee mingled with cinnamon rolls hung in the air, leftovers from the potluck that had just wrapped up. Folding chairs groaned under the weight of the townsfolk, farmers in worn flannel, teachers with tired eyes, and kids clinging to their parents' hands. They'd gathered for one reason: to hear from Captain James "Jimmy" Carter, a local hero back from his third tour in Afghanistan. Jimmy, a broad-shouldered man in his early 30s, stood at the front of the room in his crisp military uniform, medals gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His buzzed haircut and steady gaze carried authority, but a weariness lingered in his eyes. Absent 3 years ago when he'd left this town behind, the crowd was a mix of familiar faces, old high school buddies, neighbors who'd watched Jimmy grow up, and a few curious newcomers. Rumors had swirled. Jimmy saved his entire platoon in an ambush, earned a Silver Star, but he'd returned quieter, more guarded. Tonight, he was here to share his story. At least that's what the flyers promised. Amid the sea of people, one stood out: Noah, a 9-year-old kid, skinny with messy brown hair and a faded Captain America t-shirt. He sat in the front row, sneakers dangling above the floor, clutching a small American flag his mom had grabbed from the dollar store. Beside him was his mother, Sarah, a single mom pulling double shifts at the diner to make ends meet. Noah's dad, a Marine, died in Iraq when he was a baby. Sarah had whispered to him before they arrived, "You can ask him, but only if you're ready." Noah nodded, his small hands trembling as he rehearsed his question in his head. Jimmy kicked things off, his voice deep and even, recounting the basics: the scorching desert heat, the brotherhood of his platoon, the gunfire that still echoed in his dreams. The crowd listened politely, clapping on cue, but the room felt subdued. They wanted more than facts. They wanted to know the man who'd come back to them. Noah fidgeted in his seat. The flag in his hands crumpled from nerves. He'd been waiting for this moment for months, ever since spotting Jimmy's picture in the local paper. Finally, the Q&A opened up. A line formed fast. Folks asked about military budgets, veteran benefits, even if Jimmy might run for mayor. Noah hesitated, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. But when Sarah gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze, he knew it was time. He slid off his chair, sneakers hitting the floor with a soft thud, and shuffled to the mic. The room's chatter faded as eyes turned to the little boy with the flag gripped tight. Jimmy looked down, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Hey there, kid," he said, his tone softer than it had been all night. "What's your question?" Noah swallowed hard, his voice barely audible. "Captain Carter, do you think soldiers who died, do they keep their promises?" The room fell dead silent, the weight of his words settling like a thick fog. Eyes locked on Noah and Jimmy, the air heavy with anticipation. Jimmy's smile faded, replaced by a quiet shock. He knelt down to Noah's level, medals clinking softly on his uniform. "That's a big question," he said, his voice steady but laced with raw emotion. "Can you tell me more about this promise?" Noah's lips trembled, but he pressed on. "My dad, he was a soldier too. He promised he'd take me fishing when I turned 10. But he didn't come back. I'll be 10 next month. And I just want to know how he can keep that promise." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Sarah covered her mouth, her eyes shimmering with tears. The room, buzzing moments ago, went so quiet you could hear the heater humming in the corner. Jimmy didn't answer right away. He studied Noah, then the flag in his hands. And something shifted in his gaze. He stood slowly, leaning on the podium for balance, and took a deep breath. "You're Noah, right?" he asked. The boy nodded, eyes wide. "That's a question I've wrestled with a lot," Jimmy began, his voice low and deliberate. "Over there, I lost some good brothers, men who made promises to their families. Just like your dad did. And I used to wonder, do those promises die with them?" He paused, his gaze drifting to the back of the room, as if he could see the faces of the fallen. "But then I figured something out. Those promises, they don't die. They live on in us, in the people they loved, the ones they left behind." The crowd leaned in, hanging on every word. Jimmy's voice softened, vulnerable now. "I had a buddy, Marcus, best soldier I ever knew. Always talking about his little girl back home. He promised he'd build her a treehouse when he got back. But Marcus didn't make it. An IED took him out on patrol." Jimmy's voice cracked, and he cleared his throat, gripping the podium tight. "I was there when it happened. I held his hand as he slipped away. The last thing he said was, 'Tell her I love her. Tell her I'll build that treehouse. Even if I'm not there.' I didn't get it then. I was so angry, at the war. At God. At myself for not saving him." Noah's eyes glistened, but he didn't look away. Jimmy knelt again, his voice a whisper. "When I got back to the States, I visited Marcus's family. His daughter, Ellie, was about your age. I told her what her dad said. And you know what she did? She asked me to help build that treehouse. So we did, me, her mom, some neighbors. It wasn't perfect, but every nail we hammered felt like Marcus was there with us, keeping his promise through us." A tear rolled down Noah's cheek, and Sarah pulled him close, her own tears falling free. Jimmy stood, his gaze sweeping the room. "So, Noah, I believe your dad's promise is still alive. He might not be here to take you fishing, but that promise lives in you, in your mom, in this town, and if you'll let me, I'd be honored to take you fishing on your 10th birthday. To help your dad keep his word." The room erupted in applause, mingled with sniffles and rustling tissues. Noah's face lit up, a shy smile breaking through his tears. "You'd really do that?" he asked, his voice small but hopeful. "I'd be proud to," Jimmy said, his eyes shining too. But the night didn't end there. Jimmy's words had cracked open a floodgate of feeling. An older man in the back, his face etched with years of farming, stood up, his voice shaky. "I lost my son in Vietnam," he said, hands trembling. "He promised he'd take over the farm someday. I was so mad at the world for taking him. I forgot to live for his dream." Jimmy nodded, his eyes gentle. "It's never too late," he said. "That farm, it's his legacy. You're keeping his promise alive every day you work it." A woman in her 40s, a local elementary teacher, raised her hand. "My brother was in the Navy," she said, her voice breaking. "He promised to walk me down the aisle at my wedding. He died in a training accident. And I never got married. I've been too scared to move on." Jimmy stepped closer to the stage's edge, his tone warm. "He'd want you happy," he said. "He might not walk you down that aisle, but he's with you in spirit. Let him keep his promise by living the life he wanted for you." The room buzzed with a quiet energy, not from noise but from shared vulnerability. Folks who'd come expecting a standard hero's speech were now part of something deeper, a collective reflection on loss, love, and the promises that bind us. Jimmy turned back to Noah, his voice firm yet tender. "You reminded me tonight, Noah, that being a soldier isn't just about fighting battles. It's about keeping promises. Even when we're gone, it's about the people we leave behind, who carry our love forward." The crowd rose to their feet, clapping not just for Jimmy, but for the moment, for Noah's courage in asking, and the healing it brought to so many. As the applause faded, Jimmy walked over to Noah. Kneeling once more. "You're a brave kid," he said, his voice low. "Your dad would be so proud." Noah nodded, wiping his tears with his sleeve. "Thank you, Captain Carter," he whispered. Sarah hugged her son tight, her eyes meeting Jimmy's in a wordless look of gratitude. As the night wound down, the people of Cedar Falls lingered, sharing hugs and their own stories. Strangers who'd entered with polite nods left as friends, their hearts a little lighter, their burdens less heavy. Jimmy stepped off the stage, his uniform still sharp but his shoulders looser than they'd been in years. He glanced at Noah, now laughing with some kids, the flag still clutched in his hand. And in that moment, Jimmy knew he'd truly come home, not just to his town, but to the promises he'd made to himself, to the brothers he'd lost, and to the people who needed him most. If this story tugged at your heartstrings, hit that like button to let us know it moved you. Drop a comment below, share your own story, or just say, "I cried," because we'd love to hear from you. And if you want more stories that touch the soul like this, hit subscribe and ring that bell. Together, let's keep those promises alive.